Hello everyone, welcome to another chart here. This time we're going to talk about something I didn't cover in the main video, which is AOE comps, and why I think they aren't really going to be one of the major options, though are still potentially viable, which is why we got this new tier called What's Missing. We'll get into that. Like with all the charts, obviously this doesn't cover everything, like potentially running Pencil as the anchor anyway, allows something like Splash in here, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. I'm just going to talk about the standard stuff, and then I'll briefly go over why I think some of this stuff does not work. So, first off, anchor category. I think that these two are your main ones by a mile. Both of these provide both paint and AOE, which is important. While Rapid Pro Deco is, in theory, something you could pick for a few maps, I think what ends up happening is there's not enough paint to sustain the entire comp. These anchors, however, provide paint and AOE. You get bucket angles and blaster explosions. It's a lot to work with. I think Wellstring tends to cover things a little bit better since the location incentive focused kit helps out with the AoE, and the damage to objects covers one of its main flaws, being fighting stuff like bubble or wall, but expos are both pretty good as well, are a little more self-sufficient in this comp. Now, this is another one of those comps where typically your second slot is almost always going to be vanilla bucket in this case, which is why I say here these can stack at this point, because you could do like bucket plus machine, or like something like that. You could even potentially drop the bucket and do like machine plus RB, but typically right now with how the game is balanced, you'll most often see bucket strikes cover a painting flaw, and it works with pretty much everything I've talked about a little bit in a previous video. But machines go here in terms of also being able to stack a little bit, like you could run machine plus bucket, or the other way around, like with bucket, machine plus one of these, or bucket plus one of these, and it's probably fine, but in this case I think machine more is going to be slotting into this slot as much as possible, but it's just another AoE option. V machine in particular has a bit more flexibility with the Fizzy Booyah Bomb kit, just not as powerful as vanilla bucket, but both of these are much less power in terms of actual slaying. They more have to work with other weapons, and instead your trade-off is getting these powerful kits. As for the blaster, bucket RB is of course the main one you see. In fact, it's not uncommon to see like shot, bucket, RB, and like a pencil, but that would be a bit more of a different comp that just still is, your midlines are AoE focused in this case. Range and bucket combo very well with each other, and range blaster has a bit more of the selfish specials, plays a little bit more for the solo kills, while bucket could be a bit more flexible. Stamper is an interesting variation because you have burst bombs to cover AoE a little bit, and caster gives you angles, but this is probably the least AoE focused weapon we have in this entire chart outside of some of the paint capability, which really just comes with the kit. But the advantage here is Stamper can make up for a lot of the speed weaknesses. You can even argue that Stamper can kind of go here, like I've seen Stamper RB a little bit, but I think that's more something you run with Pencil rather than something you would run with one of these anchors. Vanilla Blaster. I think this one is gotten a lot better since the patch. Obviously, range has gotten a little bit worse, but I also think it's a little bit interesting because of the kit. Having a stable bubble for some of these slower weapons to be able to use is actually quite useful, especially for something like Wellstring that can't really sit in the open normally. So I think it adds a little bit to the comp there, and is probably a bit better versus short range. And then Rapid Deco is another bit more kit focused, kind of like the machine for this category, where a bit less solo killing, but you're going to get a bit more coverage in terms of the kit tools you have. Torp and Jet are very good with all of these other AoE options. And then your paints, like with the dive comp, is kind of limited. Even here, I don't think Try is, like, it's kind of hard to run for similar reasons to before, but Fizzy's very good with AoE. And then Zap is your typical painting weapon that you'll usually see with these comps. So instead, I think it's time to talk about what's missing here, because these are options that are like, you think that these would be typical in an AoE comp, but you don't really see them. Why is that? So let's get the obvious one out of the way, which is Dynamo. Dynamo wouldn't actually go here. It would more than often go here. Technically, you could argue it could do either, but I think Dynamo is the one that opens up comps the most, or really any other painting weapon that can have cooler would open up comps a lot, because then you could run all of the other short range stuff. In particular, people would love to run this weapon with AoE comps because the burst and crab synergizes so well with them while covering paint. So Dynamo could potentially fill that kind of anchor slot if it got cooler a little better, if the weapon was a bit stronger. You could have something like Splash in the short range role. Another option would be something like Dread. Dread could either have an entry kit like Bucket and could replace the bucket. You get a bit more paint in this category, a bit less slaying power, and can work around this special output, or it could be the cooler weapon, and then this could be your cooler slot, and then who knows what this could be. You could run another short range shooter. You could run like 2 of these plus Dread, something like that. Could be very interesting to see, but that isn't possible, obviously. Custom Dowser, if it painted a little bit better, could in theory take the anchor slot, now that it has the ink efficiency to use Burst Bomb for its team and cover the paint weakness. That could be kind of interesting and make it easier to run something like Try for the Cooler if you had this like super paint focused anchor due to the main weapon being able to paint decently plus strike. But in this case, the main weapon just doesn't paint enough for that kind of thing. S-Blast has Burst Booyah, another AoE focused kit, but the main weapon doesn't really have enough prominence in AoE for the long range mode. It doesn't really have any Burst Bomb combos to be threatening people. Hammer doesn't work well enough for this comp. For Wellstring, that's pretty obvious. And then Bucket is very close, but again, one that's kind of hard to run. But in this case, I'd say it's more because this is necessary. If you could pick something like Dread and do a similar role to Bucket, but paint a little bit more, then it'd be a lot easier to run Bucket Deco alongside it. But because this weapon is basically the necessity for so much of these comps, you almost always are having this, it makes it really hard to run Bucket Deco. Like, I guess you could do Bucket plus Bucket Deco. There's nothing super wrong with that, but it's pretty rare to see. None of these are, like, impossible to see in these kind of comps, but they don't really slot in as easily as they probably should be. And that's really kind of where I think this comp kind of falls apart a little bit. There's just a lot of challenges that you have to overcome. It's hard to run enough paint for the comp. Your short range weapon is very limited. Your specials are extremely limited. These are going to be either selfish or very weak. Like your Bucket Strike is really the only powerhouse special you have to go in, unless if you do something like Bucket Stamper, which is probably the hardest version of this comp to do, is like Bucket Stamper, one of these. But in theory, that could maybe work as well. So the comp's very difficult. It's very hard to run the amount of specials you need. There's a lot of speed problems, and really just the variations that would help open up this comp to more flexibility, to being, one, more accessible for people to try out, and two, having a bit more flexibility to adapt to what could be played against it, just isn't really that available or is underpowered. This is still very fixable for the most part. I think Dynamo Bus would be the biggest one, obviously, since this could really open up a lot of the other slots, but some of it I don't think is going to happen. Like, without a third kit, I don't think Dread is going to really slot into this. In theory, you could say it goes somewhat in this category, but I think it's not really worth it. S-Blast, I think, needs a bit better damage to combo with Burst or other options for the long range mode to really be worth it. You can't really buff the radius size since, you know, that's this weapon's thing. Wellstring, I think if Hammer was a little bit more sufficient, could maybe work, but this one might just not be built for the comp. And then Bucket, you know, I kind of already talked about this. I think it would more open up if other options were there. But also some kind of dart buff. I don't know if there would be a dart buff that would really help this option, but that would be something that might work. All in all, I just think that these comps are sadly a little bit too limited to see too much use. You would really need a lot of weapon specialists to come together and be willing to push the comp, and there's not a whole lot of adaptability you can do when people are adapting to it, which means while I think that this is a cool option of comps, it's really missing too many things to allow the pieces to come together for a strong composition. So that's where I think AoE is right now.